Welcome to the second episode of the Texas Hillstory podcast, Texas history from a Texas history teacher's point of view. I'm your host, Cam Hill. For those of you who are returning listeners, I cannot express to you how thrilled I am that you're back. For those listening for the first time, I'm a Texas history teacher in Arlington, Texas, who was looking for a way to incorporate a podcast into an online lesson for my students. When I got started, I enjoyed it so much I decided to expand it and make it a podcast for anyone interested in the history of Texas. One of the things I mentioned in the first episode was that I love small towns in Texas. So many times the little town you pass through on your way to one of the big cities here in Texas has a rich history, or at the very least some historic significance. To me, the neatest part is that even if a small town doesn't have some great story tied to the overall history of Texas, it does have its own local history that is woven into the tapestry of the town's very essence. It makes that small town even more than just a home to the residents. It gives them something to hold on to, and it's often a major source of civic pride. For instance, my hometown, Cedar Hill, Texas, was founded in 1846 along a branch of the famed Chisholm Trail. As soon after it was founded, it became the county seat for Dallas County. But in 1856, a deadly tornado struck Cedar Hill, killing at least 9 people and leveling all but 2 structures in the town. Not long after, the county seat relocated permanently to Dallas. Now, very few people in Cedar Hill know that, but those who do are often caught wondering, what would have happened if that tornado hadn't torn up the town? One of the things after the first episode is I had a couple of people message me and say, man, we really want to hear about small towns. We love small towns in Texas. And trust me, I do have some stuff in the works, and I will get to that soon. Now, along with my love of the small town, I also have great admiration for the little-known heroes of Texas, the average man or woman who finds themselves thrown into a situation that, unbeknownst to them at the time, will make their names important in the annals of history. Some names we remember, like Erastus Deaf Smith. By the way, it's spelled deaf, but pronounced deef. And we'll talk more about him somewhere down the line. Some names we don't remember, though, like, for instance, Samuel McCullough. And I know you're thinking right now, wait, who? Samuel McCullough? What did he do? Well, before we get to Sam McCullough, I need to get something out of the way. Several years ago, I was teaching 8th grade U.S. history. By the way, I hated it. We were short an 8th grade teacher, and my principal asked me to teach it. I did it 1 year and ran screaming back to Texas history the next year. Now, because I was teaching 8th grade and had taught 7th grade the year before, I had many of my students 2 years in a row. Now, this leads to a certain level of comfort and familiarity. And one afternoon during my 8th period class, we were talking about the causes of the Civil War, and we were discussing slavery. I had made several references to African Americans during the class when one of my students raised her hand and said, "Mr. Hill, we're black. You don't have to call us African Americans, just call us black." And several other African American students in the class chimed in supporting her. And I told the class that, I said, "I'm sorry, but I just feel more comfortable saying African American." And as a note, I still do. Now, these young ladies stayed at me with a level of persistence the likes of which I have never seen. In the end, I told them that I would try it. So for the remainder of class, I used the term black. Now, they all applauded me for expanding my horizons, and I told them I appreciated them being earnest with me about the subject. And the next morning, I went in to my 2nd period class feeling confident, and I used the term black to describe enslaved Africans in the South. Now, immediately, one of my most vocal and challenging students whirled in his seat and yelled, "That's racist. You're racist." And I was left stammering, saying, No, the girls in 8th period, they said it was okay to say black. Okay, hey, I'm African Americans. Let's move on. And I was properly shamed for using the term. And it would be several years before I would even attempt to use the B word in my classroom. And the reason I bring this story up is that we pull history from many different sources. Some of them are primary sources, which come directly from someone who was present at an event of historical importance. Primary sources often use the vocabulary of the day. During my podcast, just like in my history classroom, I will never use any term that is considered a racial slur or hate speech. I will, however, use words and descriptions that are acceptable terms to use when teaching history and cultures. That being said, Samuel McCullough was a black man, or to be more specific, he was a man of mixed race. Now, I could go on about this for an hour, but we'll save that for another episode too. Just understand, back in the 1830s, if you were of pretty much any percentage of mixed race, you were considered both socially and legally to be black. Samuel McCullough Jr. was born October 11, 1810 in Abbeville County, South Carolina. As I mentioned, he was of mixed race. In 1835, his father, Samuel McCullough Sr., a white farmer, migrated from South Carolina to Jackson County, Texas. Along with him, he brought his son, Samuel Jr., 3 younger daughters, Jane, Harriet, and Mahaley, all of whom were also of mixed race, 2 women of mixed race named Peggy and Rose, whose slave status is unknown, and 1 free mixed race girl named Aldi. No mention is made of the children's mother or mothers. Many have assumed that McCullough's children, that their mother had been a slave, but I could find no proof of that. Nonetheless, Samuel McCullough Jr. was something out of the ordinary in 1835 Texas. He was a free black man living in an area known for white people owning slaves of African descent. So Samuel McCullough Sr. and his family moved to a spot on the Lavaca River in Jackson County, Texas. Jackson County is situated about halfway between Houston and Corpus Christi, sitting pretty much right on the Gulf of Mexico. McCullough wound up moving to Texas in May of 1835, less than 5 months before Texians would fire a small cannon at Mexican soldiers on the prairie outside Gonzales, Texas, igniting the Texas Revolution. Leading up to the Revolution, there was the speculations and rumors that always preclude war. As the summer of 1835 began to turn to the autumn of 1835, stories began circulating throughout Texas of outrages being committed by Mexicans against Anglo settlers in and around the town of Victoria. Victoria would have been very close to the McCullough homestead, and I'm sure, like any young man of 24 years in a time when revolution is in the air, it didn't take much prodding to get McCullough to want to join the fray. On October 5th, 1835, Samuel McCullough Jr. joined the Matagorda Volunteer Company as a private. Leading McCullough and the volunteer company was Captain James Collinsworth. Collinsworth would go on to sign the Texas Declaration of Independence. He served as the first Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court, and he was even a candidate in Texas' second presidential election in 1838. Unfortunately for Collinsworth, he celebrated his candidacy by getting rip-roaring drunk on a steamboat in Galveston Bay, falling overboard and drowning. Traveling to Victoria, the company apparently found no outrages being committed by Mexicans or anyone else for that matter, and continued on to the Presidio La Bahia near Goliad. The Presidio, or Mexican fort, set midway between San Antonio and Copano Bay, which was a major port on the Texas coast. Goliad was used as a stopover on the supply lines from the coast to San Antonio and other Texas settlements. The Presidio was manned by somewhere between 20 and 30 Mexican infantrymen, and late in the evening on October 9th, 1835, approximately 50 Texans stormed the Presidio by hacking through the wooden doors at the north wall with axes they had borrowed from the citizens of Goliad. Eyewitness testimony says that Sam McCullough Jr. was the first Texian through the gate. As fighting broke out inside, McCullough was shot in the right shoulder by a Mexican musket ball. During the Texas Revolution era, the Mexican army was equipped with a number of different types of weapons. Mexico still had thousands of Spanish weapons in their armories left over from the days before the Mexican Revolution in 1821. They had also been purchasing arms from the British, since Mexico really had no major facilities to produce the number of weapons that would be needed to equip an army. No one can say what type of rifle or musket was used to shoot Samuel McCullough, but it's safe to say, from comparing the main weapons used at the time, that the musket ball that hit his shoulder would have been somewhere between the size of a nickel and a quarter. Now, when the ball hit, it would have torn flesh and shattered bone, causing fragments to lodge in the muscle. What's not taken into account much of the time is that the ball would have also embedded dirt and cloth fragments in the wound, which would have undoubtedly led to some sort of infection. The Battle of Goliad didn't last long. The Mexican commander, worried that the force of Texians may be much larger, ordered his men to lay down their weapons and surrendered the Presidio. Record keeping being what it was in those days, we really don't know the number of Mexican casualties. The best I can tell, between 1 and 3 Mexican soldiers were killed and several were wounded. Samuel McCullough Jr. was the only Texian injured. McCullough is historically referred to as the first whose blood was shed in the War of Independence. He was loaded onto a wagon and taken to his father's home in Jackson County, where he would spend over a year recuperating. In fact, the musket ball would remain lodged in his shoulder for nearly 9 months before it was finally removed in July of 1836. Samuel McCullough Jr. would spend the remainder of his life handicapped by his shoulder wound. Now, exactly how much mobility he regained in the shoulder and the arm, I have no idea, but he was still able to join Texas forces against the Comanches at the Battle of Plum Creek in 1840, and even served as a spy in the Texas Army, sneaking into San Antonio when General Adrian Wohl and a force of approximately 1,200 Mexican soldiers occupied the town for 9 days in September of 1842. Now, in 1837, McCullough married Mary Lorena Vess, the white daughter of one of Stephen F. Austin's earliest settlers. And even though interracial marriage had been made illegal in Texas 2 months before they were wed, McCullough was never charged with a crime, possibly due to his service to Texas. The couple had 4 children, and they remained married until Mary's death in 1847. At least one of their sons, Lewis Clark McCullough, fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War, despite the fact that he was 1/4 African American. As a disabled veteran of the Texas Revolution, McCullough was entitled to and awarded a league of land for his service. A league of land is a unit of area equaling 4,428 acres. McCullough kept 2/3 of the land and sold the remaining 1/3. Eventually, he relocated his family to Von Ormy, Texas, which is about 15 miles southwest of present-day San Antonio. In his later years, he attended reunions and gatherings of veterans. He lived out the remainder of his life peacefully as a farmer and cattleman. Samuel McCullough Jr. passed away on November 2nd, 1893, at the age of 83. We don't know what kind of man Samuel McCullough Jr. was. We do know that he was willing to put his life on the line on more than one occasion for Texas and for the people of Texas. We know that he was a free black man in a time and place where black people were, as a rule, not treated very well. Yet he persevered and even prospered, both as a businessman and as a family man. He is one of just many early Texans who gave above and beyond what was asked of him, and the history of Texas is much richer for it. That's it for the second episode of the Texas Hillstory podcast. I hope you like what you heard, and I hope you learned something. If you did, please make sure to leave us a positive review on iTunes. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for upcoming episodes, please feel free to contact me. You can visit our website at www.texashillstory.com. Send me an email at texashillstory@att.net. Look us up on Facebook at Texas Hillstory Podcast, and you can follow the show on Twitter at Texas Hillstory. Until next time.